5 reasons to choose full frame over micro four thirds. Number 1. Yes, the GH5 and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera are actually really good in low light, but in order to do so, they had to sacrifice megapixel count. The GH5S, like the A7S II, can achieve such great low light capabilities because it makes its pixels bigger and therefore each pixel can capture more light. Notice how the A7S II and the GH5S both have pretty low resolution sensors, the GH5S being at about 10 megapixels and the A7S II having about 12. This is a lot lower than most DSLRs. But the A7S II is still way better than the GH5S in low light. The reason being because larger sensors equal larger pixels, and larger pixels equals higher quality pixels, which results in less noise. The A7S II is full frame, which means the sensor's about 35 millimeters wide, and the GH5S has a micro four thirds sensor, which is about 19 millimeters wide. For the GH5S, it's 19 millimeters. It's a bit bigger than most other micro four thirds sensors, and that's mainly because of a specific decision by Panasonic to do that, but we don't have to get into that right now. This means that if a micro four thirds camera and a full frame camera have the same amount of pixels, the pixels on the full frame camera will actually be about 50% larger, resulting in less noise. Larger pixels also have better dynamic range, and this is why most full frame cameras seem to have better dynamic range than cameras that have smaller sensors, but in reality it's because the pixels are bigger. Two cameras that have the same megapixel count but different size sensors, the bigger sensor is going to have better dynamic range because its pixels are bigger. You might be thinking, Tom, the GH5S can do up to 12,800 ISO and still be usable. Why do I care about the A7S being able to do up to 50,000 and still be usable? Like, I'm never gonna use that anyways. Well, that's probably true, but here's where the advantage comes in. If a larger sensor means more surface area to put more pixels on, that means that you can achieve similar low light results to the GH5S with a larger megapixel count. And that's exactly what the Sony a7 III can do. The a7 III can do about 12,800 ISO and still be completely usable, but it has a 24 megapixel sensor as opposed to the GH5S's 10 megapixel sensor. Most professional photographers that are probably gonna put their images on billboards or blow up their prints real large are probably gonna look for larger megapixel counts than what the GH5S has. And while I love the GH5S and everything that it can do, it's one of my favorite cameras, it's probably not a photographer's first choice, and part of that is due to the low megapixel count. Number 2 is shallow depth of field. Now, in my 5 reasons to choose micro four thirds over full frame video, I explained why shallow depth of field isn't always a good thing. And by the way, you can watch that video up here somewhere. And I stand by that. I don't always think that shallow depth of field is a good thing. But the key word here is always. You know, just because something isn't always good doesn't mean that it's not good at all. Shallow depth of field still looks incredible, and I personally still love the look of a Canon 1DX or Sony a7S II. I don't personally need that for my shooting style or for what I make, but it still has this unique, incredible, glorious look to it that you can kind of spot with your eye no matter what. It just has a really unique, amazing look to it. Now, I know storytelling and shot selection and composition and all of this stuff is much more important than shallow depth of field, but sometimes I miss the ability to shoot at f1.4 on a full frame camera. As of right now, the lowest that you can go on micro four thirds is f0.95. And that'll give you about the equivalent of f1.9 on full frame, which is still good, but it's still not as low as 1.4 or even 1.2. Now, although I'm completely fine with that, it just doesn't seem like you're ever gonna be able to go lower than that on a micro four thirds camera unless you're intending on adapting glass. Number 3 is native autofocus, and this goes hand in hand with what we just talked about. Yes, you can get the equivalent of f1.2 on a micro four thirds camera, but it does come at a cost. A speed booster can allow you to adapt aps-c or full frame glass onto smaller sensors like a micro four thirds camera, but it's still an adapter. So when using an adapter, you're not only putting another access point in between the lens and the camera's communication, but you're also using a lens on a camera body that weren't meant to go together. They weren't built to go together. Now, we all know that the GH5 and GH5S suck at autofocus when using it in continuous autofocus for video, although the newest firmware update for the GH5 actually fixed a lot of those problems, so I'd recommend that you upgrade your firmware if you have the GH5 and test it out. But for photographs, the continuous autofocus is actually really good. It does a great job of tracking people, and it does a great job of just being snappy and quick. And so for photographs, I'd say it's completely fine. The problem is the fastest native autofocus lens for Micro Four Thirds stops down to about 1.2, which is about a 2.4 equivalent on full frame. The lack of depth of field on Micro Four Thirds cameras is especially noticeable when shooting with wide angle lenses such as a 12mm, which roughly translates to a 24mm on full frame. The solution to this would obviously be to use a speed booster and adapt a full frame lens or an aps-c lens so you'd get better depth of field. But like we talked about, it's putting another access point in between your lens and your camera, and you're also using a lens that isn't built to work with your camera, and therefore it results in slower autofocus. No matter what you're doing, there's always gonna be some weird bug that you're gonna have to work around. Number 4 is lens selection. Now, I actually really love the lenses available for Micro Four Thirds cameras. The Voigtlander f0.95 lenses are amazing, and they have such a nice, creamy, rich, vintage look. I really enjoy using them. They're really smooth to focus, and they just look really, really good. They're also super fast, f0.95, that's incredible. They give really amazing bokeh, but when it comes to lens variety, Micro Four Thirds is just not the best. Now, Canon and Nikon have been around for much longer, so they've had more time to explore and put new lenses out and whatnot. And Sony really doesn't have the greatest lens selection either. But my main problem with the lens selection from Micro Four Thirds is the way that they make their lenses, and specifically in relation to the GH5S. Now, before I go on, I just want to make this clear. Micro Four Thirds has pretty much almost every lens covered, and you shouldn't have a problem with building an entire kit. So there's absolutely nothing, like I built an entire kit from just the Micro Four Thirds lens selection that we have natively. So don't worry about that. I'm not trying to say that they don't have enough lenses. I just wanted to be clear on that before we continue. But what I don't like about these lenses is what they choose to add to them. Here's an example. The GH5S is my second camera for shooting weddings because it doesn't have in-body stabilization. But it's actually gonna be my main camera for shooting receptions because of the better low light capabilities. The problem is I really like shooting my dancing footage handheld because I like to get in and up on the action, and it just looks a little bit more natural. But the problem is it doesn't have the in-body stabilization, so it can look really jittery and shaky. The solution would be to buy a lens that has built-in in-body stabilization. It's not gonna be as good as the GH5's in-body stabilization, but it's still gonna take away those shakes and micro jitters. The problem is I can't find a single native Micro Four Thirds lens that has both image stabilization and mechanical focus. Every single native Micro Four Thirds lens that has any sort of electronics in it at all is focus by wire. And while that's really great for autofocus, it's horribly inconsistent for manually focusing, and it makes it really frustrating and difficult to work with. But Tom, what about those Olympus Prime lenses, the ones that stop down to f1.2? Those have both mechanical and focus by wire because of the focus clutch. Yes, but those don't have image stabilization. This is kind of a huge issue, and to be honest, I don't really understand why focus by wire is even a thing. I think it comes down to cost. I think Sony invented it because it's cheaper, but Canon's dual pixel autofocus is the best in the game by far. Like, nobody even comes close, maybe Sony, but all of their lenses are mechanical. So I don't really understand why focus by wire is a thing. And the solution to that is buy a third-party lens from Canon or Sigma or Tamron or Nikon that has, image stabilization or vibration reduction, and adapt it to your camera. But like we talked about, adapting glass isn't always the best way to do it. I would be okay with adapting glass, but there's this part of me that's not 100% sure that the image stabilization inside the lens is gonna communicate properly with the camera that's not built for. So I don't wanna go and waste my money on a lens when I'm not 100% sure it's gonna work the way that I want it to. Number 5 is the market. Right now is the time to be a full frame shooter. Every camera manufacturer in the world is racing to make the best full frame mirrorless camera with the most features, the best quality, and the best bang for your buck. I love the GH5, I love the GH5S, and I think these cameras are future-proof, to be honest, so I don't intend on straying away from the system that I just bought into. But it seems like every camera manufacturer right now is fighting to have the best full frame camera on the market, and they're all beating up on each other like children to try to get to that point. You can't really go wrong right now. If you buy into the full frame ecosystem of any camera manufacturer at this point, you're probably gonna get a really nice camera that has a lot of good features and produces really incredible images. Unless you're Canon, and then you repurpose older cameras into smaller bodies with larger lenses that shoots the same quality 4K as it does 1080p. And that's why they have to have the best autofocus and color science, or else they'll go out of business. Anyways, those are my 5 reasons to choose full frame over micro four thirds. I wanted to make this video as a counter argument to my original video that actually got a lot of views, and I'm grateful for all you people that have come from that video, so thank you for subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you didn't, leave a comment down below and tell me why. I'm always open to feedback and criticism. If you're here to give some hate to me, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to tell you why you're an ugly butt face. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this, but that's gonna do it for this one, so I'll see you in the next video. Peace.